IVM.
Great science needs great journalism as well, and that's in short supply in India. On the Pragati Podcast today, let's talk to Nandita Jayaraj and Vasudevan Mukunth, who are two fantastic journalists tackling science in different ways. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. There's a great and growing disconnect between journalists, journalism, and the public trust in media. On the Pragati Podcast, I make a small attempt to bridge that gap by talking to journalists working in different fields about their work and how they do what they do. Previously on episode 65, I had the chance to talk to Dhanya Rajendran of the News Minute on running a purely online news platform and about journalism during the time of natural disasters. On episode 68, James Crabtree spoke about being a foreign correspondent working for the Financial Times London while being based in Mumbai. And on episode 80, I got to speak to Devirupa Mitra of The Wire on being on the foreign policy beat in New Delhi. Today we talk about science journalism in India, how it may be different and how it not be. My guests today are Nandita Jayaraj and Vasudevan Mukunth. Nandita is the co-founder of the lifeofscience.com, an independent collective and a media platform focusing on women scientists in India. The platform includes articles, interviews and a podcast as well. Mukunth is the science editor for The Wire, who built up the science section of The Wire from the ground up. He also has a special love for writing on the physical sciences. A small disclaimer, the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation, IPSMF, is a donor to both The Wire and Pragati. This is purely incidental, and in any case, the views expressed on this podcast are purely personal. Before we get started with the episode, Kannada Barutta, I host the Tele Harate Kannada podcast along with Surya Prakash and Ganesh Chakravarti, and every Wednesday we have fantastic conversations on Bangalore, Karnataka and the world in a very Bangalorean mix of Kannada and English. Banni Keli, the link is in the description. We'll start our conversation with Nandita and Mukunth after a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please make sure that you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Just a couple of notes up front. One is that we're still running our listener survey. That's ivmpodcast.com/survey. The survey is only going to run till the end of the week. So if you want a chance to win that awesome mug that we're giving out, please make sure that you fill out that survey. Also, I wanted to put out a quick reminder that if you're enjoying what you're listening to, please take a screenshot of what you're listening to, tag us on Instagram, and we'll put that in our story so that everybody else can see what you're listening to. Also, please don't forget to put in a comment. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by lawyer Ambar Rana, who talks about his family's army background, how jingoism is detrimental to patriotism, the noteworthy cases in his law practice, and how he addresses them on his podcast, Know Your Kanu. That's on the IVM network. On episode 2 of our new foreign policy show, States of Anarchy, Hamsani talks to Dave Salvo and Brett Schaefer about Russian hacking in the US elections. On How To, Citizen Meghnad and Shreyas are joined by comedian and satirist Ashish Shakya to discuss Chapter 9 on public facilities. On the Sponge Podcast, Ambi explains why it is consequential to set expectations on a realistic level and then slowly elevate them. On Shunya One, founder of Ayapo, Chirag Kriplani, joined Srila Ditya to talk about the growing Indonesian tech startup culture. On Ganatantra, Saryu and Alok are joined by expert Venkat Anand to discuss the influence of social media in the coming elections and how it has changed the playing field. And with that, let's continue on with your show.
Hi Nandita, welcome to the Pragati Podcast. And hi Mukunth, welcome to the Pragati Podcast as well.
Nice to be here, Pavan. Thanks for the invite.
Pavan. Hi.
So I'm lucky to have two science journalists in India here with me. So that would be maybe 10% or 15% of science journalists in India in one room over here. Or maybe not, correct me later. But could both of you give me a sense of how science journalism might be different from other forms of journalism, or is all good journalism the same?
You want to take this?
Okay.
Both of you get to take it now.
You want to take it first?
Yeah, this is the only question I had time to think about before reaching here. So, I think there are differences, but I feel like it's more important to talk about the similarities because there is this tendency to think of science journalism as something totally different and something maybe even easier and more, armchair and not so on ground as a lot of other beats. But I think science journalism actually can be so much more, and it should be so much more than just science communication of the latest research. It can be investigative, analytical, social, and it doesn't always have to be result oriented, which is unfortunately what we're seeing in a lot of science media these days. It has to be as much about the process as it is about the
most of it is very
outcome.
triumphalist, right? So,
yeah,
this blockbuster new drug has been discovered for this new disease or something
exactly.
like that.
Or, something like IIT students come up with a water treatment. There's no real discussion on how does it work, and if there are so many innovative solutions being produced every week, like we see in the paper, why is the situation not improving? So there is a need to go into those aspects of the story, which people are doing, but it is a minority. And since we are only seeing the outcome-based things, people think that that's all that science journalism is. But I feel like it is actually a lot more similar to any other beat.
Yeah, Nandita basically said it all. Just to add to that, so the point about how science journalism is treated like this other kind of journalism, it's similar to the way science is treated in society to a large extent, wherein, scientists are a separate, they are parallel instead of a part of society. So that kind of treatment sort of percolates into journalism as well. And this is actually, I would venture that this is the case in many newsrooms that have a science reporting unit within India, at least, wherein editors let someone else take control, give them autonomous control of their particular department and not interfere much. Most of the time, many science journalists, I think, myself included, obviously, seek a lot of guidance on how to go about covering stories. Because when you look at political or financial journalism, people have been doing it for a long time, number one. And number two, it is more easily successful than science journalism is in many ways, as a result of which people have thought about this for a very long time, and they know about the different kinds of stories that are in there, the different kinds of issues involved in covering stories. Whereas for science journalism, that whole space is quite nascent and, lacking mentorship. There are a lot more science journalists today than there were before. But by virtue of this, anybody who's working in a large or well-equipped or, a good newsroom is automatically at the cutting edge. They are at the front of the shockwave. So there is not much to bank upon. So that kind of heritage, that kind of legacy wherein knowledge is passed down, that kind of thing is lacking a little. Okay, not a little, lacking a lot. The other thing I wanted to talk about processes is that, yes, that is a big thing that is missing. It's actually, I would say, missing in many parts of the world where science journalism is, practiced. But there is more consciousness in those places and a lot more people talking about why we need to focus on processes instead of outcomes. So in this, even when you talk about processes and outcomes, so I think there is a kind of division that exists in the kind of, let me give you an example. One is, I am the science, health and environment editor at The Wire, right? Health and environment are easy to cover because there are a lot of takers, right? But when you talk about science as in pure research, forget about the outcomes. I don't care who proved what, right? I'm talking about how you took on a problem and went with it, and, the trials and tribulations of the process. And so when you come to the physical sciences, there is almost no process. There is very little outcome that's being covered and almost no process that is being covered right now. And for the life of me, I cannot find enough journalists / writers of the science, umbrella, who want to take on the physical sciences, or I would say, physics / chemistry / biology at the theoretical level, right at the foundations, because a lot of what we see today in terms of, people clamoring, saying that, you should invest more in R&D, you should invest more in fundamental research so that, your long-term benefits, your long-term prospects improve, the opportunities for, translational research and technologies improve. In the longer run, this is not something that, one government or one term can see to fruition. So there is this kind of mismatch, where you have, another way I would put this, I guess, is that, even though there are a lot of people coming in who want to write about the life sciences and who want to write about conservation and ecology, that kind of thing, right? So they are still motivated, I think, not by the science itself, but by the kind of issues that the country is facing right now. And that's fair. But the thing is, we don't have many journalists coming in at all saying that I want to cover science. Because what they're covering is, what they're going after is that, stuff that's causing problems that they can see right now manifesting, which they're able to trace back to certain roots and say, this is the problem. This is not what we're doing right. And this is what we need to fix.
But Mukund, I think you are in the minority among science editors who think this way, because for a lot of science journalists who do want to cover, the physical sciences and more difficult to explain sciences, it will be probably hopeless for them to try and convince the editors to try to
Absolutely.
get space.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few takers.
Yeah. So, it's a very tricky situation.
It's a tricky situation, but I would say the trade-off has to be something like, if, for example, from Anil Ananthaswamy's NCBS science writing workshop, this is what I plan to tell them this year. When you finish the workshop and you come out, and I know most of you are going to want to write about the life sciences. Okay, I'm not going to, I'm not deluded. But here's the deal. You give me 2 life science pieces, or you give me 1 life science piece. I will help you with a second life science piece. I'll give you a very good story if you give me a physical sciences story.
Okay. So wait, so now biology falls in the life sciences here or the physical sciences in your definition here?
It depends on what you're
fair enough.
Right, working on. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But tell me something. So one part of what may be reasonably unique about science journalism would be sci-com, right? So the idea is that there's all the scientific knowledge that is being generated that is sort of locked up in scientific journals, right? So even if, say, Nature or Science is notionally a public journal, first of all, it's behind a paywall. Second, it's written in a language that can only be read by experts, right? So a long time ago, I was doing a little bit of work in biomolecular nuclear magnetic resonance, right? NMR. People outside that one narrow field would not understand papers written by people in that field, right? So there was that silo culture built in right there. And sure, even places like Nature and Science will have like 10% or 20% of pages devoted to more simply explaining what the technical papers are.
Right.
So, but here, where do you see the role of science communication, and where does journalism take off beyond that communication?
The way I see it, science communication isn't only about research communication. It's about the practice of doing science, the system in which science happens. So, I think it's very, very interlinked. Of course, we say we often draw the difference between science journalism and science communication, that journalism is more rigorous and more, a little more thorough and analytical and
those all seem
investigative.
Like judgmental things, except for the investigative part.
I would say that, it's journalism is in pursuit of the truth and has to be in public interest.
And science communication need not be?
Science communication would include science education, I think. Yeah. Like, even bringing it to schools and all of that. Even that is science communication. Scientists talking to children. Whereas science journalism, where would you...
this is like a pet peeve.
Okay.
There's a problem. It's also tied into, how I want more physical sciences coverage and stuff like that. So the thing is, Nandita mentioned this very important point, which is education. And science education in the country, at the high school level at least, is poor. Okay, I think we can all agree on that. That said, when you talk about science journalism and we're talking about science news, especially, stuff that's recently happened and you want to cover it, the thing is, if something has recently happened, for example, physicists in Europe and the US, even in India, around the world, in fact, are basically talking about, building the next big particle collider. And which country should build it? Should CERN build it? China build it? Japan just backed out of its, they're leaving the International Linear Collider in a limbo. These are all heavy duty, large scale, big collaboration, heavily funded projects that everybody should get a say in, right? Now, this thing has recently happened. Now, when I write a news copy on this, I am going to have to spend about 500 words, which would be half the length of the whole story, basically laying the foundation, talking about this is how this works, this is why we all care about it, and stuff like that. And then I go on to the actual story itself. In J school, we learn that, inverted pyramid, that's how you write. But in science writing, it's actually the pyramid, which people would think are the most dispensable facts. We need to lay that groundwork in every article before we actually can go on to discuss something.
So the amount of things that you can assume people already know is much smaller in this space than, say, in many other spaces, right? Yes. Say, if you're talking about the economy and so on, there'd be some GDP news that would come out. There'd be a separate article talking about this. And then you can do one the fact that, deeper
people
piece,
have headlines that say that repo rate has been cut to something and have no clue what the repo rate is. Right. But they let it pass because they assume that many people know about it.
Yeah. But the reason that on the economy, on the business pages and the political pages, a lot of people don't understand is because they assume that people know what this is. So sometimes I feel that all kinds of journalism need to devote a little more into background, because there's always people looking to start understanding, and it's really hard to do it if you don't know a lot already. So I think at least in science we've acknowledged that this is needed and we're doing it, but in a lot of other fields of journalism,
and I guess the other problem that can also be common between science and other places is also journalism by press release, right? So there's a new paper that comes out which is flashy, then someone puts out a simply worded press release out of it, and then that is churned out into a story of some sort without more thought and conversation happening into it, right? And that to me feeds into what you mentioned earlier about the whole triumphalist sort of discussion of science. Oh, this is a great new discovery that has come out. But no, this is paper number 553 in a long line of research. And sure, they've made some 5% advancement on something, but let's get the foundation right. And let's figure out what it takes for now this fantastic innovation to actually reach the market or society for it to make difference to anyone. Right. So that is the same link, right?
Yeah, even with the, the whole result-oriented press release thing, the way science is being done today, it's highly unrealistic that one particular result is going to make the change. So you have to look at, like who else is doing this? What body of knowledge is it adding to? And if the report does not include the whole background and what else is being done, then I think it's really pointless to do these reporting of a single paper, which I have to admit I used to do myself, and we used to receive great encouragement to do this. So I didn't even realize what I was doing was kind of really empty and meaningless.
Actually, I disagree. I mean, I don't think it's really empty and meaningless. We do a lot of that, of single paper coverage. But that's the thing, right? We take care to say that, slow down here. This is what's happening. This is the background. This is just one piece in a very big puzzle that's going on. And yeah, I mean, we don't pick up all papers and write about them. Some papers make more of a deal, mean more than others do, relatively speaking, at least.
But I don't think everybody is doing that. Not everybody reports giving that, this is only...
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a way to do it, but I wouldn't say that, if you do it, I mean,
it's a waste of time.
Yeah, it's a waste of time.
Right. Yeah, but also you have to think about the reader when they read it. Just reading a line saying that there are limitations to the study and is not really... I'm just going to remember what was written in the first paragraph. And the number of times people are telling me, like just last week, my brother had this fit with my parents that he, maybe it's not very relevant, but my mother has this habit of when she makes Maggi noodles, if she's making 3 packets of Maggi noodles, she only puts 2 of the masala tastemakers. And that pisses my brother off so much. So I think it was the last day at home, so he was a little emotional, and he just lost it when he found out my mother had put too little, and he started citing very strongly somewhere that he read that Ajinomoto is not harmful after all, and he just wouldn't let it go, and he was like, you have to see that paper, so he just, I mean, I don't know, I have to see this and see whether it's real, but people really just believe that one thing that they read, especially if it's something they want to read.
A glass of wine every day is fantastic for you and for your heart, right?
On some days.
So I think especially globally, I think in nutrition and a few other things, there's a huge trend for really, really bad coverage at sort of the bottom end of the tail of this science journalism. But tell me a little more about how you've seen science journalism in India. So how many journalists do you think there even are? How many newspapers do you think devote people who are looking at science and who, I mean, like with every other beat, you need to build some domain knowledge and experience, right? So some of that comes from your time in the newspaper or your time doing journalism. Some of that comes from your academic training and more. So like say if someone's covering foreign policy, they should be knowing a bunch of things about how that whole apparatus works, right? So how does that work in India? How many people would even be reporting on science?
I mean, that's difficult to say.
Less than 100?
I guess.
But I don't know. I mean,
I think that's a limited.
Sorry, yes. Yeah. No, I mean, I also don't know the numbers. In fact, I was looking, but it's really hard and it's really unfair if we don't include regional science media, which has been going on for much longer than we think. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know in terms of numbers, but it's clear that it's not enough. That's all I can say.
So could you tell me a little about science journalism teams then that you guys have been a part of?
Just one point in addition to what Nandita said. So basically, when you ask about how many science journalists there are, this is again, I think, somewhat of a reflection of the way we treat science/science departments within publications, wherein we say they're a separate unit. There are these guys, they cover science. The others do too. They just don't know it, or they just don't call it that, right? People who go on the city beat, the city department, right? They're talking about disease outbreaks. They're talking about, blood donation campaigns. They're talking about availability of groundwater or, water recharge, that kind of thing. These are all science stories too.
Yep.
And they all speak to different kinds of people who provide quotes and, share their expertise. It's just not called science stories, or it's not put on the science page.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Right. So, I mean, if you took that into account, I wouldn't draw any lines. Everybody can be a science journalist.
So then let me flip that question around. Do you see a lot of science related coverage then in newspapers that is sufficient? Or how much would that be? Because even if you include all these sundry examples where there is an element of, be it hydrogeology or, water quality science or something, is there enough of that happening in India and of enough quality?
Guess that even if there is not quality is a question of so many things, including the political economy of journalism itself and how it's funded and whatnot. But I would say that there is also sort of a growing consciousness, at least in the quote-unquote good newsrooms, a consciousness, that has to do with, basically when we write about certain things, which kind of people we need to have spoken to before a copy can go to print and stuff like that. So I think that I would venture that is on the rise in these particular newsrooms and in the, the part of the space that I'm familiar with, which is English speaking.
I think that there is, like Mukunth said, a lot of things that we are reporting about in the, front pages and city pages do have very important science angles, but they are not being explored enough yet. For example, even something like the miners who were stuck in Meghalaya, right? So even there, right, that was, I think there would have been such a difference if there was a science journalist tackling this topic, because then you could really understand the enormity of and the odds that they're facing and the possibility of rescue and a lot of things. And for example, I noticed recently that Priyanka Pulla had written about the ISE blast that happened last year. And I think if you read the way she had written this versus the way a city reporter had written it, there will be a marked difference. So even though that kind of, health and environment reporting is happening daily, it's not done scientifically enough and with enough scientific input as it should be. And what is happening is whenever there is a fantastic science reportage that happens, they push it to the the front page or maybe the feature page, which is great. I love seeing science out of the science pages, but I don't think that means the science page has to be so bland and so boring. I'm talking again about mostly print papers, not so much online, because the division is a little blurry over there. It can be both in the front page and in the science page. But for a lot of print papers, the science pages are either completely sensational with sexy news and coffee news and women's brains and men's brains, or they are what I consider really good work. It's really important to highlight work being done in India, but it's so unimaginative and it's so, these scientists doing this work deserve a little more coverage and a little better, and the journalists deserve a little better, attention and showcasing of their work.
And to me, the worst of all is when Indian newspapers are reprinting articles from New York Times, Washington Post, others on
That's
science
because
issues.
there's not enough people there.
Why is that? Why do you consider that?
No, in the sense of, a lot of the times they need not be relevant, or some of them are pure curiosity, and I think there could be better things that could be used in that space. And
I guess, but in a newspaper, yes, there's an opportunity cost. You use that space, you fill it up with something that may or may not be relevant, But for online publications, that opportunity cost is not there.
Right.
And that way...
no, I'm not saying republishing is a bad idea.
Right.
I'm saying that sort of meaningless republishing from a foreign source which may not have relevance to your audience. When you republish something on The Wire, you picked that story from whichever
I picked
source.
That story, but sometimes I pick a story because it's nicely written.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, there is, and even sometimes there's a way you can put a little more effort into using these foreign stories and making it, like it doesn't hurt. Okay, maybe you're talking about like an AFP story or an AP story or a Reuters story, which is different. But for example, what I used to do when reporting, research that came from New Zealand or the US is it add a Indian context to it, or at least a quote by an Indian scientist and sort of bring it to relevance. So I don't know if you can, I mean, I guess it's too much effort to do that for the...
See, this thing about Indian scientists, good that you mentioned it. Many of them are very difficult to contact.
Yeah.
They don't get back in time. They don't think this is, important. I've had one guy who I reached out to in a particular month. He got back to me 3 months later and said, here, I have spoken to you. Send me the link as soon as it's out.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's because we tend to look at the same names over and over again,
Right.
or, you don't. But then, for example, the project that I'm doing, I've come across so many people from you would not have heard of if I had not, gone and met them, because the websites are so miserable and
Right.
they are so... Some of them are really passionate about science communication and they get back really quickly. So there is some sort of a gap between scientists
Yeah.
who want to communicate.
Definitely. And there is also, institutions that have an outreach cell tend to have more people there who are willing to speak to the press.
Yeah.
And, willing to respect journalists' time. They're basically cognizant of how it all works. So yeah, there is definitely that mismatch. And especially when people start out, these outreach cells can, make a big difference. And for example, if you want to cover the life sciences, and there's NCBS in Bangalore, and they have a good outreach unit, and there you have a lot of people there, as well as a lot of, postdoc students, all kinds of people, who are willing to speak up. And, and they also speak well. I mean, it's one of those elite places in the country. So there is a big problem of discovery.
Yeah.
And, and thanks to initiatives like the Life of Science, we are discovering more people that we can speak to. But otherwise, this process of discovery, like you needed something like the Life of Science, for example, to put in so much work to discover these people. And this is not something that a newsroom, has to do so many other things, something that it can undertake, because it doesn't have the bandwidth for it.
Yeah.
So
and sometimes the scientists themselves, I try to, because there are a set of scientists that all of us sort of know we can fall back
Yeah.
on, because deadlines and everything, you need to look at convenience and time. But I think that these scientists also should sometimes think that, okay, if first of all, they might not have so much time, but in that case, they should make the effort to suggest me. It could even be a postdoc of theirs who is equally an expert in an area, and
Right.
we sort of help us branch out this network. Maybe we can ask them. So that's one way.
So I do want to spend some time after a little break to talk about Life of Science and the Bioscience and, what you've both been trying to build. But before that, there are a lot of science-related institutions in India where notionally only the director or extremely senior people are the only people allowed to talk to media, right? So they have to follow a chain of command, especially if it's a research lab of some sort, or there will be a press officer and you have to get permissions before
Yes, we all know who you're speaking of.
But that, do you see that culture changing?
No.
No.
Okay.
At least with the
but you
usual
are seeing a
suspects.
few institutions where there is an active sort of SciComm unit and more being established, right? If I'm not mistaken, IISc now has a science communication unit. NCBS also has people. So someone who can at least,
Sure.
if you reach out, they can maybe even connect you to the right scientist.
Yeah.
If
And also universities, as far as I know, have no restrictions at all. So a lot of university and private university professors are happy to talk, and they're often a lot more frank and
Eager even.
than research institutes. Research institutes, I mean, there are a few who are okay to talk. There are a few who are crazy difficult to speak to, and
There are a few, and who believe that science communication is not something that scientists should undertake at all.
Yeah.
So I want to come to that. So, well, this is as good a time as any, so I've also had a chance to speak to several scientists, and there were some who were saying, look, if it's a personal issue, like if it's a personal interest, go ahead and do science communication. But otherwise, you're wasting your time. You're not a serious scientist because you're taking time away from serious academic research and doing this communication.
Right.
And there are people who say, look, I teach and write my papers anyway, so all my work is in the public. So why should I do more? But the most nuanced view I saw was, I think there were some scientists I know who were wary of science communication being used as a negative incentive, where if you don't spend time on science communication, you'll lose some points on your tenure track or something.
Right.
And they said that, look, we have enough things on our plate already.
Right.
And a young scientist in India who's setting up a research lab has to do civil engineering because they have to design the lab space.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So honestly, being a young assistant professor on a tenure track, if your institution has a tenure track, is a nightmarish condition anywhere in the world, including in India. So was someone like that loading a science communication mandate might seem excessive.
Yeah.
But how do you see this among scientists?
So I think last year, or maybe the year before that, there was a fiery Twitter debate with, I think, Gautam Desiraju on one side, and Shruti Muralidhar and Prasad Ravindranath on the other, as well as
multiple. Was it some
others.
Confluence or something?
No, I think this predates Confluence, wherein they were basically talking about exactly this. I mean, the conversation went to many places, and a lot of people came away thinking different things, The debate itself was, I'm glad that it happened, But beyond that, yeah. So there is this section of scientists who believe that others must also do it. And there is this section that, that believes that there shouldn't be a top-down approach wherein somebody comes and says that you must do this and everybody does this and the problem is solved. The problem is not solved. You have new problems. I just think that those who can should, first of all, that, I get it that not many people will be able to as a result, but that frees us, for now at least, to deal with a lot of other issues that need to fall in place so that everybody is able to undertake science communication, right? And this is problems on multiple levels that need to be solved. Now, that said, people who have the time, they know how this works and they're able to articulate themselves and they have views, especially, should come forward and say it, because those are the people who will be giving excuses, that I think will be relatively weaker than the others.
I know what you're saying. Tell me if this is right. But say when debates happen on genetic modified food crops and organisms, you actually don't have enough bioscientists who are actually stepping up and saying, hey, I actually work in this space.
Yes.
These are the risks.
Mm-hmm.
This is completely okay.
This is exactly what happened last year. And I needed a story on CRISPR and I couldn't find any scientist to take it up. So I approached Nandita and she wrote about it.
Yeah.
So basically you need scientists who know a topic.
Know the topic and should be able to recognize that, this is in the news and public perceptions are being shaped right now.
Yeah.
And it's time for an expert to step in and just, be able to guide the conversation in the right direction.
Yeah. I'm not on this side of anything being enforced as much as I think it's important, because it's really empty to enforce something, like Mukunth said, without ensuring that the conditions are right for it. The same debate came up with, so when MHRD said that it's compulsory for all university lecturers also to do some research, on one hand, this is great because there are a lot of university lecturers who are trained for research and want to do research. But on the other hand, it's crazy to expect them to do it when the conditions are so poor, when they're so overworked. Similarly,
and when there's no money, right? There's barely any research money that's really making it to a large number of scientists.
Yeah, and the same thing for scientists doing communication. If you don't give them any space for this kind of freedom, and when there is this culture of silence and fear of speaking, for example, I'm not surprised. I feel like it's made a bigger deal than it actually is. But in my interviews, the fear, it's so palpable how afraid some scientists are to speak, and the fear of hierarchy and the fear of being called out for something which I don't know. But now increasingly in a political atmosphere, you're seeing these crazy kind of reactions to all things said. So when it's like this, it's also, we have to understand that this is probably why nobody wants to talk about it. But
and there is bureaucracy and then there is academic bureaucracy, right?
yes.
And there's politics and then there is academic politics.
Yes.
So all of that might play a role.
Yeah. So if, it has to come from the top level. It has to be the university, I don't know, the vice chancellor or the director of an institute who's coming out and saying some bold things, and only that can embolden scientists to say what they feel.
Yeah. But not in the terms of, the Kauravas invented cloning or whatever. Not like that. That was a VC, but no.
I don't think people are waiting for permission to say those things.
Yeah, see, that's another problem. Feel very free to say, stupid things. But knowledgeable things,
it's
keep quiet. Don't
that.
Participate in the March for Science, for example. Seek permission before you speak to journalists. It's weird.
I also wanted to point out that we were talking about scientists who feel, and these Twitter debates where there have been scientists who feel that science communication should not be the biggest priority for scientists. In my 3 years of almost exclusively talking to women scientists, I can't think of a single instance where a scientist I've talked to has been less than enthusiastic. They might not have been great at it, but most of them were more than happy to speak about it, and at least 50% of them even told us that this is a big priority for them and that they go to school. So I'm wondering whether it's also sort of more prestigious a scientist is. They feel like they're too self-important kind of thing, and a lot of women in not senior positions tend to be less, I want to get to the top type. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
This is an entire, I think, other discussion that we probably ought to have separately, which is about women in science, right? And I think we'll touch upon that a little when you talk about your work. But I was flabbergasted at attending a few of these meetings where there's somebody doing a science-related presentation, some professor, someone visiting from somewhere, and the last 2-3 rows are occupied by women, and all the men sit up front. I mean, this was bizarre to me and not something that I had seen even in the nonprofit space or other spaces, but was happening in the scientific space. So, I think that's a larger conversation, and we'll be back after a short break to talk to both of you more about science journalism in India.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday
on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm Pavan Srinath, and I'm here in conversation with Nandita and Mukunth on science journalism in India. So, Nandita, could you tell us a little more about the life of science and lab hopping and what you're trying to do within this space?
So, if you go today to thelifeofscience.com, what you're going to see is stories about science that the women scientists of India are doing. We have over 100 profiles of active women scientists today, as well as other articles about gender inclusivity in science in the country. So Ashima Dogra and me, who started this project, we always saw this as a science journalism project. But it just so happened that by now we're known as the women in science people, which is really awesome, but it's also sometimes annoying because every single talk or every single panel I'm invited to is about women in science, which I feel like as long as we're seeing that as a separate topic from science itself, is the problem is still existing. So there's 1 or 2 times when I've been invited for talks on either science journalism
regular
or science communication. Yeah.
So there's women's science and regular science.
Yes. So those times are special for me. So what we ultimately want thelifeofscience.com to be is a collective of science communicators who are making science content which is coming from India, reporting about environment and all kinds of issues. But we will always have a feminist lens, and we will always be looking at stories and looking for stories from a perspective of women and minorities and minoritized groups in India.
Right.
But yeah, our vision is to be finally seen as science people and not women and science people. And so as part of this, we're also there's a lot of on-ground activities also that we're doing, because we recognize that a large part of the public is not online. This includes kids and people who don't have the internet. And of course, there is a big thing of English. We only publish content in English. Sometimes we try to get it translated, but it's a little challenging. Yeah. So basically, what we usually call the lifeofscience.com is a feminist science multimedia project.
All right.
And
and lab hopping is one part of that.
Yeah, lab hopping is actually just a Twitter handle that I thought was catchy in the beginning, and then people started identifying. So it's the same thing. It's just the act of hopping from one lab to another. It's the same as the lifeofscience.com.
And you also have a podcast where you talk to various women scientists from across the country.
Yeah, I mean, all our interviews are audio recorded. Some of them which were good enough quality, we have made them into podcasts. We have about 10 podcasts that we've made so far. One of our plans for later, the second half of this year, is to have a better podcast, a little more conversational, and maybe not just one-on-one interviews, but talk about different issues. And so that's part of the plan. Yeah, and we have a lot of other stuff, videos and stuff. Yeah.
All right. And Mukunth, I mean, you managed to build a fantastic, I think what you've done with Wire Science, I think we've seen so much more science stories coming at us sort of every day compared to whatever things were before. So tell us about how you started this and what you're aiming to do.
Okay, so when we started The Wire, we wanted to focus on 6 major areas. Politics, political economy, science, law, culture, and I think gender. I'm not sure after the first 3. Sorry.
But one of them was science.
Yeah, one of them was science.
All right.
So we picked these areas because we felt, foreign affairs. We felt that, so basically the funda was that, what should we write on? Write what you'd like to read, right? And we felt that in these particular areas, we weren't able to read the kind of stuff that we wanted to. So we said, let's produce it ourselves. So this was the foundational idea, and this was almost 4 years ago. And so now, so this kind of thinking also got into the Wire Science, that we would like to write what we'd like to read, and we try and identify things that we want to read but cannot find in the Indian journalism space, and we set about producing them. So this has been the general thinking. And mostly this has come out in the form of stories, at least more often than not, I'd say, on research, basically. So we have an audience, or at least we've built an audience that is okay with reading through about 400 words of really technical stuff. So we put in a lot of effort in the editing process. We get someone, as long as we're able to find writers and they're able to plumb something, speak to someone about something, lay out the whole process. If say some particular discovery is made and it comes out in a paper, right? We spend a major chunk of the article talking about the technical aspects of it, right? It's a form of science education that's embedded in the news, wherein we say that this is how it works. This is the instrument that they used. Here's a little bit of history. This is a spectrometer. What is spectrometry? We really go into that and spend a lot of time on that. That's one thing, I think one of the ways in which we've tried to differentiate ourselves. Another way is that we go after a lot of science and society kind of stories, basically talking about the wider context in which the practice of science is embedded. And this context can be political, economic, whatever, sociological especially. Talking about how scientists work, the kind of problems that they face, science is, it functions in this sort of interconnected space, but wherein a lot of things basically need to fall in place. It's not like, I wouldn't say that if it was a giant Venn diagram with multiple circles and all of them overlap, and then at the center there is science. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying science is one of those circles, right? And at the center is, the society that we live in. And so basically to talk about science, in a way that remains cognizant and acknowledges at all times and is in conversation at all times with all those other circles, right? So those kinds of stories. Now, that said, in terms of what we're trying to build, so this sort of ties into the other stuff that we've spoken about, we spoke about before in this on this podcast, which is that, the context in which science journalism is practiced, right? And you have the siloization within newsrooms wherein, the science department is separate. I'll give you an example. Growing up, almost everybody I know who follows the science news, growing up, they read the Hindu, right? And they remember the science page that used to come out on Thursday. Now, if you go back and looked at it and see on how many days there were advertisements on the science page, right? That's going to be a very small number of days, right? So the newsrooms that sort of dedicate or have traditionally dedicated a lot of resources to the coverage of science have done so not because science is marketable or science is very easily sellable. It's not something that's born out of, demand. It's something that's born out of principle. That people maintain and run these departments as a matter of principle. Says we must have a science section. And I don't care if it's loss making, I'm going to support it. Because, I subscribe to all these. Whatever. So in this context, if you don't have something that is, we don't yet have, I think this would be the long-term goal, to set up a science newsroom that is financially viable in the long run, right? In and of itself, you've had stories of multiple magazines that try to, Scientific American, for example, coming into India and trying to set something up and then, flopping, moving back out. It's not very viable at the moment. We need to figure out a way to do this. And at The Wire, we have donations and subscriptions, and those are doing fine for now, but, we haven't really been able to slice the data the way we'd like to, all kinds of resource constraints. So that's one long-term goal that we're building towards. But this journey that we're taking is that, we understand that this is going to be very difficult. Now here, instead of building just yet another newsroom, right? What we're trying to do is, think about the science reader. You, Pavan, for example, if you want to, you're interested in science stories and you want to read something, you go online, you go on Twitter or Google News or wherever, Facebook, social media, yeah. And you would have subscribed to a lot of these publications that put out science stories, and these stories appear on your feed. You click on them, you read them, that's fine. So you inhabit this sort of continuum. It's not like a lot of people are coming to The Wire. Like, it's not like a science reader. It's not like The Wire Science is her only source of science stories, right? There are other newsrooms. There's the Print now with Sandhya Ramesh there. There's the Hindu. It's always been there. There's Indian Express. There's the Hindustan Times from time to time. There's Telegraph. And these are just the ones I read. I'm sure there's a lot more. And so they all put out stories. So the way we want to do this is, try to be sort of resource efficient in the way that, we try and identify what kind of stories the Hindu tends to do, what kind of stories the Print tends to do, and stay away from them. So that, we don't want to flood you with the same stories with, multiple articles on the same issue over and over again, right? The idea is to sort of participate in this newsroom that kind of exists horizontally. It's a newsroom that encompasses all of these publications, and we are all covering science. So let's try and contribute to this by, producing stories that none of them is producing, but which we think will be useful for the Indian science reader, right? So Sandhya Ramesh does a lot of astronomy, for example, and we're very happy to retweet those stories from our, Twitter handle, for example, and say, dear The Wire Science reader, we know you're interested in science. Here's a nice science story that you might like. And we cover stories that others, may not, be covering. So that's the kind of experience that we want to set up, at least now in the short to medium term kind of thing. And as we figure out a path to viability and, tack on more resources, at that point, we'll start thinking about really becoming a newsroom in our own right, out of this sort of community newsroom. So that's viability is one. Yeah. I think viability,
I think in general, journalism in India is trying to figure out how to be financially viable, right? Yes. So within that, I'm sure science journalism will have even more difficulty if we were covering more science.
Can I just add a little bit about the life of science also, which I feel like I didn't articulate properly. So the thing is, right now, for the past 3 years, we've been collecting a vast amount of information that is all, in our emails, in our audio tapes, and some of it has been coming out as interviews that you'll see on the website. But what we want to be doing, again, a part of the second half of this year, is to finally collate all this information and put it in a format, build a database, sort of a search tool that will get the names of these women scientists to the public, be it other science journalists who want to quote people for a story,
Right.
or if it's schools who want to invite women to speak in their conference, or a conference whose manel needs to be demanelized. So we keep getting these requests from journalists, from people organizing conferences, saying, do you know any women who work in this area? Do you know any women who work in that area? And since we've done interviews almost, in many states of India, we also have people from all kinds of places. So if a school in Madhya Pradesh, obviously they don't have the budget to call somebody from Bangalore, so we can find a scientist for them in their state. So we want to build sort of a tech interface, and there's a lot of these tech solutions coming up and a lot of tools which people are not using. So one thing is we want it to be multilingual, so anybody can use the tool. And the second thing is to keep this connected with the audience, we'll keep publishing. That's where the collective of science communicators that we want to build comes in. So we will keep publishing content about these scientists who are in the database, about the different things they're doing, and other stories. So that's the ultimate vision of
That's
the
amazing.
life of science. Yeah.
So, this is great because in general, there is at least a little bit of a disconnect between scientists and the larger public.
Yeah, a little bit.
Little bit. Just as short as the walls on our public research institutions and the size of the gates and the procedures that you need to go through to get into those. But even within that, so many women scientists who probably would not have been given recognition otherwise. Yeah. It's great that you're able to
and
connect
not just
them to
women
people.
scientists, actually. Women, because they're 50% of the population, we talk about them more. But in many cases, there are women from parts of the upper, more privileged parts of society who have a lot more opportunities than men who are in Dalits or lower castes or
Right.
different kinds of socioeconomic statuses. So it is a simplification that we keep saying women, but what we ultimately want to become is a voice or a place where we can welcome voices that we've been ignoring for so long into the fold. So in fact, when we started the Life of Science, Ashima and I just thought, let's do the first few months, let's focus on women scientists. That's why the name was the Life of Science, which, even our logo has no sign of being a women in science thing. But then we found out that there are so many women scientists, there's no shortage. 2, there is a huge problem.
Right.
And we're nowhere near ready to open it up, I feel, to everybody, because but at some point we do see it being open for all. Yeah.
So it's about science and about inclusion, right?
Yes.
Not just on the lens of gender.
Yes.
All right. So I wanted to ask both of you now about, stories that you might have written, stories that you might have chased. I want to sort of get a sense of what it takes to write a really good story. And I know that each story will be different in how you tackle it, each idea that you explore, each triumph and how it comes out, or each problem. But any favorites of yours that you worked on in the past that you could talk about what went into writing that story?
Yeah. So typically, Ashima and I have made a very conscious decision to not go chasing specific people or stories, because we come with our own biases and it's likely that we will fall into, who defines what is a good story or who's a good person to
No,
talk
here
to?
I'm saying you're defining what a good story is.
Yeah, but I'm saying even when I'm defining it, I might get drawn to the usual suspects. So for us, at least with the Life of Science, the best stories have come up when we've gone and met a totally random person. So I'll give you one example of a story that I thought was a really important story that I did as part of the Life of Science. So this was, usually we don't target scientists to interview. We just sometimes walk into laboratories and find out if there are women working there and ask them for an interview. Or sometimes if I'm in a specific city or town, I Google and I find out whether in this institute or university there's anybody working. But this, occasionally we get people who nominate people, saying that we think that this person should be interviewed. And in such a case, I once got an email from a man who said he was a professor at a university in Telangana, saying that that he came across a project and he thinks that we should talk to his wife, who's been through a lot of odds. So since it was like a husband recommending the wife, I mean, there was like a healthy amount of skepticism. I didn't give it too much notice. But when I did happen to go to Hyderabad the next time, I decided to meet her. So I wrote to him and he connected us, and then I went and met her. And and her story was quite heartbreaking, but it was also, as you know, it was such a powerful sign for me of the kind of people that we're ignoring, because I don't know if she's ever going to become a superstar scientist or whatever. She was 50 when I met her, and she had come back just 2 years before, after an 18-year career break, which she had to take after doing her PhD and after having doing her PhD in a very prestigious laboratory in India. And then she had accompanied her husband so that he could work at JPL, NASA's JPL in the US. And she also did some work at Caltech and everything. And then she came back, and their marriage did not come with support from the family, because it was an interreligious one. And so when they had kids, they had no support. And her daughter had muscular dystrophy, and they had a son who was also unwell. So, and with zero support, she was unable to manage, and she had to drop out. And every time she felt like coming in, she could not come in because nobody was ready to give her a job after a few years break. And she herself, I guess, had some confidence issues. Finally, she was able to come back because of the DBTs, one of the Women in Scientist schemes, which allows women to come back. But, her story was, I feel like that's why it's not, if you chase the award winners and if you look for the inspirational stories and the motivating stories, you find out that most of them come from the same kind of background. Most of them will talk about enormous support from their families or from their husbands or in-laws. They all have the same line. Even if you look at Leelavati's Daughters, which is essays by women scientists in India, a really great book that the Indian Academy of Science came out with, you'll see that a lot of women there who are also in quite higher positions have had very privileged backgrounds. So that's one story that I felt was a good one. But in terms of process and what all went behind a story, one story I really enjoyed doing was while I was at the Hindu. So it was a story that I wrote for Sunday magazine, a feature story about a scientist, a male. But so his name was PK Sukumaran, and he passed away in, I think, the 1990s. So I actually first heard about him when I was still in journalism school from our science journalism professor, Dr. Subaya Arunachalam. So I think in one of the first or second class, Mukunth was also in the class with me. He told us about this person called PK Sukumaran, and who, is like this hidden gem in Indian science. And in my enthusiasm, I volunteered to do a story on him and promptly forgot for the rest of the 10 months because we had a lot of other things to do. And then when I joined the Hindu, I really wanted to do, at the Hindu, I was working at the children's newspaper. They had a children's daily, which I was producing. So I was really aching to, write some good feature stories. So when I got the chance, I pitched this story to Sunday magazine, and they said, go for it. So all I had for PK Sukumaran as a source was his niece, who used to write a lot on Scribd there. So she used to write a lot, and she had written a lot about her uncle. And he was a pioneer in sickle cell anemia research in India. So his story is special because he just passed class 10. And he was not a PhD or anything. He joined Pasteur Institute, which was in Coorg, as a lab attendant. So he was washing the lab equipment and everything. And from there, he went to being one of the world's most renowned experts in sickle cell anemia. And so it was really challenging because he had passed away in 91, which is before the internet. So there was hardly anything about him online. So I had to, through his niece, I had to write to his then colleagues who were, 95 and 98. And I was just like praying, please don't die before I finish this story. But some of them responded and sent me the obituaries they wrote and some really old pictures of him with some of the tribal people near Coorg who I believe were very prone to sickle cell anemia. And I mean, I would call it a science journalism piece because it's a lot about his scientific journey and about his science also. But that's a story that I enjoyed doing. Yeah.
All right. Mukunth?
I mean, I want to break from the trend a little here.
Okay.
And, the science stories that I don't know how you're defining good. Okay, so let's part ways there. I'm going to define good as something that, I've enjoyed working on. Right?
You're not parting ways there. Huh?
Okay. So the wider science has produced some good science stories, right? I think the best example would be that investigative piece we ran on the India-based Neutrino Observatory. And then we had one on the Casanova forest disease. And then we had one huge story last year about corruption in the Narcotics Bureau, like a 14,000 word piece, investigative piece. So I think we've done some great stories.
What have you had a lot of fun with?
See, I've had a lot of fun with the pieces. I'm going to sound very self-indulgent here, probably because I am. The pieces that I've had a lot of fun with is basically where I can spend about 1,500, 2,000 words talking, basically saying that, look at this. It is so bleeping cool. That's it. Mm-hmm. It's cool. Okay. Right? And I get to talk about why. And, these are not, journalism pieces per se. These are science communication pieces. But here I take a bit of, I would disagree a little saying that, when a lot of facts are unknown and some of the facts are apparently in dispute, you need an audience, a readership, society in general, basically agreeing on a way to ascertain what facts are and what the facts of a certain case are. And, that's where I think science communication overlaps with journalism to a large extent in terms of, we sort of, it's a form of, information, if it's not a conversation, basically we're having with the audience, lecturing the audience, so to speak, wherein we're telling them, there's all this stuff and you read about it and you process it in a certain way. Well, it's also possible that you're able to sit down and read about it and think that, this is really cool. Just go, wow. And that wow can be the point of the story itself, to make you go, wow. Right. And so those are the kind of stories that I really enjoy doing. And there are a lot of great science communicators in India as well as in around the world who are basically, attempting to produce such stories. And the stories that I've really enjoyed working on myself, basically stuff, I'll give you an example. I think this was the 2015 or 16 Nobel Prize. Chemistry, I think. I mean, as much as I have a problem with the Nobel Prizes, I think 2016 chemistry was these three people, I think all from Europe, basically who had won the prize for building together a car, right? Using individual molecules, right? You put this assembly of molecules on a particular surface, and then, you sort of energize this surface in a particular way. You apply heat or electricity or something like that. And this car of molecules would move along it. That is what they had tried to do. They won the prize in chemistry for synthesizing various kinds of molecules, basically through organic chemistry processes that would be able to do this particular thing. But their end goal was to build a really, really, really small car, right? Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And that was it was amazing to find out for me that, I was really happy that these guys had won the Nobel Prize because they were finally bringing back this thing about, science is so wonderful. And that's something we very easily lose touch with. So these are the kind of stories that I like working on. And I think my favorite would have to be, very difficult. Okay. This one I did recently called The Story of Dust, right? Where I spent about 2,000 words talking about why dust is amazing, where in the universe it comes from. And so this required a very large amount of reading and talking to a lot of people. I think, this is something like the Rashomon Effect, wherein you talk to so many people that in order to piece together a story that at some level, some sort of tension arises. I'm not talking about like something like a very agonistic tension, something much less than that, in terms of how different people are looking at the same thing and coming away with different thoughts and feelings, right? And that is where you realize that, up to this level, you have these facts, and then beyond that, you have this experience, right? And so that is what I want to try to bring about. So yeah, I spoke to a lot of people, and, people basically talking about dust and talking about, the different places in the universe in which dust exists on Earth, the different ways in which it influences the environment, where it comes from, stuff like that. And I just wanted to put together a story saying, you have dust. Some people have dust allergies. They get asthma attacks because of it, because it's, basically solid objects in your house that are getting like, sort of disintegrating. There is also dust in the form of, the poop of some mites, which actually causes the breathing problems. There is dust in the atmosphere. Where does it come from? There's dust in the universe that's, traveling between planets. There's dust when stars die. There's all kinds of dust. And there was a story that I really enjoyed working on because it was like a learning experience for me. I really like learning when I'm writing something. And I want to try to be able to pass that on. So yeah, so that's the kind of story that I enjoy working on.
Do you find that are the stories that you enjoy working on the most and the ones you put most work into, are they the ones that are read the most always?
I mean, yeah.
Because
if
sometimes
I enjoy when I write,
very random. Like sometimes it's a story that I found very easy to do that does so well, and something that,
Yeah, I don't write as much in science, but even in my writing, sometimes when I've said the most obvious things in the most obvious ways,
I mean,
it's well read, and pieces that I'm personally very proud of, where I've gone into a depth that I liked or explored something where like all of three people care about it, if any.
I mean, in that case, I would say that I have been fortunate enough to have the pieces that I've really enjoyed writing do well traffic and engagement wise as well.
Fair enough.
But again, I would bet that if I slice the data, there wouldn't be many Indians in there. Right? So the stuff that I'm writing about has sort of a global appeal and very long shelf life. Right? And so these people sort of tend to stay current as far as there is interest in them. And because I'm not limiting it by, geographic terms, anyone is welcome to take an interest in it. So I just put it out there and we keep sharing it repeatedly. And the uptake is there. There is a long time for uptake to be there,
Fair enough. And Nandita and Mukunth, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. We'll share a couple of the links of some of these stories that you mentioned in the description of this episode. And thank you again for coming in.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Pavan.
Thank you for staying till the end. You can visit thelifeofscience.com to know more about Nandita's work and visit the science section of thewire.com for Mukunth's. There are also a few links of some of their writings in the episode description. You can follow the Pragati Podcast on Instagram at PragatiPod, and you can follow me on Twitter at Zeusisdead. That's ZEUSISDEAD. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other platform. We are there everywhere.
Hey, this is Shridaditya.
And I'm Amit Doshi.
And we host Shunya One.
It's a really fun podcast where we talk to some of the best entrepreneurs in the country.
Yes, talking about everything from their startup challenges to what they're building and all the future of technology right here.
So catch us on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you listen to your podcast from.
Hey everybody. We have a brand new podcast series by Bloomberg Quint called BQ Conversations, which covers a range of topics like business strategies, latest trends in technology such as cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, and also personal finance. Episodes are out on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you listen to podcasts.